All right. Thanks very much, Jenny, for the nice introduction. Of course, very happy to be here today and to talk about, well, a topic that has been keeping me fairly busy, to say the least, for the last number of years. And that's really looking at sustainable food systems, sustainability, sustainable diets. And from that perspective, really see how can we also integrate nutrition and health into life cycle assessment? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? And I think the basis that we're looking at, of course, is there's a lot going on about sustainability, sustainable food systems, and we hear a lot, of course, from the perspective of the environmental impact, but that is not all. I mean, yes, we need to look at that, but we really need to balance that. We need to balance that with health and nutrition. So we need to make sure, of course, that we keep feeding people, that we provide the right food. We need to balance that as well with cultural and economical aspects because they will be critical there as well. I mean, foods need to remain affordable, whatever we change. On the other hand, as well, of course, we're looking at livelihood for a big part of the population that is in many food systems. So we need to look at it from that perspective. Culturally as well, of course, we have that challenge of if we're looking at changes, if we're looking at alternatives or anything like that, that's where we really get to that point as well of say it needs to be culturally acceptable. So if we're looking at that entire sustainable food systems, four big dimensions there, what we'll focus on for today is basically the key focus to date has really been on the one hand that environmental part, on the other hand that health and nutrition, and what is happening on that axis, how can we really integrate that as well as possible. Of course, the big question that we get in many of these cases is that enough? I mean, is that all? Is that the only thing we should be looking at? To some extent, no, because if we're looking at a sustainable diet, then it is not just about low environmental impact. There is a whole lot more about it, of course. I mean, we can also look at biodiversity. We can look at, as we said earlier, economically fair, affordable, accessible, nutritionally adequate, and even within the environmental impact, of course, climate change. Climate is only one of the environmental impacts that we can look at. In the same way, I mean, that is where, of course, a lot of focus is, a lot of attention is. Everyone is talking about greenhouse gas emissions, about global warming, those things, so that is taking center stage in many cases. And if we're looking at that, if we're dealing with that, then of course we tend to go into life cycle assessment quite quickly, quite easily to really see what is the environmental impact of products that we use. In a base is quite simple. I mean, we look at resources, we look at processing, at manufacturing, at distribution, at use, end of life, and we basically take products from start to finish. We look at what the environmental impact is. Reasonably well-established methods where we're looking with a life cycle assessment at basically a goal and scope definition. What is it that we actually want to do? What do we want to do? Is this where we want to say, okay, we want to look at cheese production? Is this where we say we want to look at milk production? Or something else? We can say, okay, what is the real scope? I mean, are we looking at for instance, cradle to gate approach? Are we only looking at what's happening on the farm? Are we looking at what's happening in the farm and in the factories? Or are we also considering what is really happening at the consumer and taking that entire life cycle in there? Typically need to do that, of course. We need to look at data collection. If we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions, then we typically convert that into global warming potential. So that's where we get into our CO2 equivalents, but we can also look at other environmental impacts there. And that part, by and large, is fairly standardized, basic methodologies available. Where the tricky part starts coming in is really that last part, interpretation of results. Because that's where you really get, okay, I have a product, I can calculate global warming potential, certain CO2 equivalents, something like that. What does that mean? Can I compare different products? Does it mean it's high or low? That is where a lot of the unclarity happens, and that is often where we say as well, we need to start integrating other aspects. Because if we're looking at LCA in a nutshell like that, calculating carbon footprint, if we're doing that for milk, quite easy in a way. We look at what's happening on the farm. We have our CO2, we have our methane, we have our nitrous oxide emissions there, of course. I mean, we have some more CO2 in collection on sites, add it all together, and we get a functional unit. So we might get 1 kilogram of CO2 equivalents per liter of milk or something else. So from that perspective, it works reasonably okay. The challenge comes when people start asking which product is more sustainable. Because that's what we see happening a lot, and that's where we start seeing as well, does that make sense to only look at things per kg? I mean, nice example that we often use from that perspective. If we compare milk to beer, Coke and orange juice, well, then what we'd really see, of course, beer and Coke actually a lot lower. In terms of pure environmental impact per kg, does that make sense? I mean, are we going to just drink beer and Coke for that reason? Of course not. So that is really where a lot of that debate comes in. Is it good enough to look at these things per kg of food product alone, or what else do we need to do? We get the same thing, of course, when we start looking at dairy versus dairy alternatives. And again, I mean, what we see, if we just compare a soy drink, an oat drink, an almond drink to a glass of milk or to milk, then yes, we would see lower environmental impact there, at least when we're looking at global warming potential at CO2 equivalents. But again, the question there, are they more sustainable, as some people would like to say, just because there's lower CO2 equivalents there? But what if we consider nutritional value as well, of course, because we know that some of these products don't contain the same nutrients as we do get from milk. So that's where we get into that whole area of how can we integrate the two of them. Because in some work from a couple of years ago, some of my colleagues at Friesland Campina looked at that as well. For milk versus some of the alternatives, started integrating knowledge and said, okay, I mean, we're going to look at this from a protein perspective and say, how many glasses of these products would we need to drink to get the same essential amino acids that we would get from a glass of milk? And then, of course, we see a very different story. I mean, compared to a glass of milk, we might need to drink 1.7 glasses of a soy drink, which might still not sound too bad for people, that you'd get some more calorie in purely from CO2 equivalent. It might still be lower. On the other hand, I mean, in 1 glass of milk to get the same amino acids in, for them was almost similar to 8 glasses of oat. When you start looking at almond, at coconut, or at rice, I mean, you start looking at ridiculous amounts, of course. So it's really that perspective of, on the one hand, looking per kg, yes, there might be a lower carbon footprint if you're looking at start taking nutritional value into account. Then what we do see is things can change a whole lot. So the big question and the big challenge in all these things is, of course, how should we do it? What should we do? And if we're looking at a lot of these discussions, a lot of these debates, I mean, it starts getting into the nice psychological tests, where you start wondering what animal you see in there. Well, you can see a duck, you can see a rabbit. in there in those things. And what it really is, I mean, same data, different conclusions. That is one of the very big things that we've seen in that whole sustainable foods discussion as well. Everybody has the same data. Many of the data are available. I mean, the carbon footprints are available. Nutritional value is available. How you link them, if you link them, those kind of things, that is really where the debate is happening, because you can almost come to any conclusion depending on what data you use. That are you deciding just to focus on environmental impact per kg of product, you will see something very different than if you start taking protein into account. What if you start taking many other nutrients into account? And that is really where, well, both the challenges and the opportunities start coming in. And that is really looking at what we said, that functional unit. I mean, in a typical LCA, yes, we would calculate per kilo of milk or per liter of milk or something like that. But if we're looking at integrating it into the diets, if we're looking at integrating it into or comparing products, then that typically is not the right basis. That so purely for the perspective of saying, I'm doing an LCA, I'm seeing what comes out of a farm, I'm seeing what comes out of a factory, those things, kilograms and liters and tons and everything, perfectly logical functional units. If we want to start interpreting those data in a broader perspective, if we want to make comparisons, that's when kilograms are not enough anymore and we need to start looking a bit further. One of the places where we try to do this a couple of years ago is work within AVO that I was involved in as well, where we said, how can we integrate the function of food into life cycle assessment? Because the function of food is not to give you kilograms or liters or something. Of course, the function of food is really to provide nutrition, to contribute to health. So the standard functional food unit in an LCA, when we do it per kg, per liter, that doesn't really reflect the function of food. So we need to include that in there. And that's where we basically said, okay, we need to go from a standard LCA that we would do on a production process or something like that, also to a nutritional LCA that really includes that function of food, which is about providing nutrients, which is about contributing to health as well from that perspective. Tricky part that you do get into when you start moving into that area is, on the one hand, it's easy enough to say doing these things per kg is not correct. We need to have nutrition in there, which is fine. I mean, not many people will disagree with that. The bigger part is then deciding what is correct, what is the way to go. And many options, and we'll go through a few of them today, show some examples there as well. But really looking at, are we looking at nutrition or are we looking at health? I mean, that's one very fundamental question already, because that can be very different approaches, as we'll see later as well. So are we just looking at food as it is providing us nutrients, or are we also looking at health effects beyond providing nutrients? I mean, the other one that we see is, rather than looking at per kg, should we start looking at serving sizes? Would that already start making things more realistic? That's where you get, of course, the difference between milk and cheese. It's fine to look at 250 grams of milk as a glass of milk, but an equivalent of cheese will be much lower. So you can already start thinking, do we need that? Big challenge that we got in there is standardized serving sizes are difficult to find, to say the least, and differ from country to country on those things. I mean, can you start looking at energy-based? So rather than looking at what does it do per kilogram or per liter, should we start looking at what does it do, for instance, per 100 kilocalories? Something like that. There's options there? In some cases, you might look at single nutrient. So what is my environmental impact per, for instance, 100 gram of protein, which is something that works reasonably well if you say you're doing it for protein ingredients. If you're looking at entire food products, then you're missing something there, of course, because we can say we start looking at environmental impact of milk per gram of protein, but then we're discounting or not considering all the other nutrients that are there as well. And the other option really that starts taking a lot of that into account, and that does seem to give some solutions, is looking at nutrient profiling. So you can look at a nutrient-rich food index. You can look at other things really and say, how can I look at a broader perspective, include a lot of the nutrients in that, and basically weigh that against my life cycle analysis, life cycle assessment. And basically for these things, I mean, for every single one of them, you can think about pros, you can think about cons. And that's been the tricky thing in all this. But looking at it, I mean, nutrient profiling is one of the big ones that has been used in the air. That might be a nutrient-rich food index, like Adam Dronowski has done a lot. Could be other things as well, but basically looking at different nutrients that we get in a product, look at them, how are they there compared to a recommended daily intake. So you basically start looking at ratios. You decide which nutrients you want to include. You can also look at nutrients you want to exclude. I mean, an example here, an NRF 9.3 that focuses on 9 nutrients to really consider encouraging: protein, fiber, vitamins A, C, and E, calcium, magnesium, iron, potassium. The ones to limit, I mean, that's where people often come up with the typical ones: saturated fat, added sugars, and salt, of course. Can be debated whether they should be in there or not, because what we see there really is there are a lot of opportunities for nutrient selection. This 9.3 is one that gets used a good bit, but we see many others as well. I mean, we've seen an NRF 6 that only considers protein, fiber, vitamin A, vitamin C, calcium, and iron. And bit by bit, people keep adding things to it. So once we go from 6 to 9, we get vitamin E, magnesium, potassium in there. We can go to 11 to 15 to 20 even. And that's one of the big things we started looking at within that work in FAO as well. Is, does it really matter how many nutrients we consider? I mean, is more better, or do we need to be really select? Should we look at specific scores for specific food groups as well? Those kind of things. That's where you can really start looking into these things. But basically, I mean, once you have composition of a product, it becomes relatively easy to calculate these things. Some work that we recently did, even considering 24 nutrients in there. And just as an example, taking an apple pie. Once we know what's there in terms of nutrients, we can basically say, okay, we calculate what's there in terms of nutrients in relation to recommended daily intake for every nutrient, take the sum of that, and we can calculate our nutrient-rich food index like that. Works quite well. Big advantage of this is all you need is food composition. So you can do a lot of this with food composition tables that are generally available in many countries, of course. And you can start coupling that. Well, we did a lot of that work in FAO as well to really look at these different products. And we took a range of products, just I think 30 products or something like that, from a database in the Netherlands that we had decent LCAs from, that we knew we could trust, and then started looking. I mean, what happens if we do it per 100 grams of product per serving? We said dry weight, because of course one of the big differences between products is in some cases there's a lot of water there, in some cases there's very little water there. High water, high moisture products basically have low environmental impact. So can we start balancing out, looking at it on a kilocal basis? So if we start looking at an energy basis, what does that mean? We did it for protein, purely for calcium, to show what do we get if we do single nutrients. And then we started considering a lot of these nutrient profiling scores as well, 6.0, 9.3, 11, 15, 20, to really start looking, where do we go, what do we score? And basically we calculated that for each of the products and then said, okay, let's start ranking them. In each column, red is the highest. So if we look at it purely per 100 gram of product here, then beef would come out the highest. By far, green are the lowest. That's typically where we see fruits, vegetables, some cereals, those kind of things coming out. And we looked at that for all the different scores and basically started looking, okay, do these rankings change depending on what score you take into account or not? And what we typically see is, across the board, beef is often fairly high. We're always looking at red, sometimes a bit of orange. It never goes to green. From that perspective, if we took the dairy products that we had in there, whole milk, skim milk, and cheese, in most cases, what we saw is it's pretty average. It's never the highest, it's never the lowest. It's always safely quite stable in the middle. And that's one of these things that we've actually seen a lot when we look at dairy in this perspective is it never comes out the best, it never comes out the worst. It's something that is safely in the middle. If we add another factor to that and say it is actually a product that brings you a lot of nutrients that are very difficult to get from other types of products, then you actually start looking at a reasonably solid position in many of these things. So what we do see there from a dairy perspective, it tends to stay in the middle. Of course, the risk when people start looking at all these products and get all these values is that you want to start comparing. And one of the big questions there as well, of course, is when are product comparisons actually valid? That's something that we struggled a whole lot with in that FAO work as well. It was never fully addressed there, but only put in as a recommendation at the end. I think that we need to look at that further. But that is really one of the big ones. We saw that example of Coke and beer with orange juice and milk. Is that a comparison that we want to make? Probably not. We don't want to compare bacon and lettuce either. And we know that realistically. The difficulty is there. The easy ones that we should be able to compare, that's easy. We can find them. The ones that we absolutely should not compare, we can find them easily as well. And then there's a big gray area where people start wondering, can we compare them or not? Because if we ask ourselves that question, when are product comparisons valid? Well, those two apples, yes, we can probably compare, not a big issue. Those two apples, very likely not. Can't compare them. Can you compare bacon and cheese? Can you compare meat and meat replacers? And that really starts coming into, do they bring similar nutrients or not? So that's one of the things we've been looking at as well, is basically, see, can we do a validation of these product comparisons by calculating a similarity index between products? And say from a spectrum of nutrients what they bring, are they even comparable? Because what you want to avoid is that somebody starts comparing two products based on nutrient profiling scores that might be similar, whereas one product is bringing you fiber, vitamin C, and potassium, and another product is actually bringing you protein, calcium, and vitamin B12. So they might both bring nutrients, but they bring completely different ones. So we said, hey, can we calculate a similarity index there? And almost from that perspective say, hey, if products are at least 80% similar or at least 90% similar, then yes, these comparisons based on environmental impact become valid. If not, then they become invalid. Can be done, something that we're working on still at the moment, but it's starting to look quite good. You can do a cosine similarity index. From that perspective, you consider basically a nutrient profile of a product as a vector. Include as many as you want nutrients in there. I mean, you can do it with 2 nutrients. You can do it with 50 nutrients in there if you wanted to. And you basically start looking at the angle between those vectors when you compare 2 products. If they're completely the same, then the angle is 0, the cosine becomes 1. So we're looking at complete similarity. If they're 90-degree different, so basically not providing any of the same nutrients, then we get an angle of 90 degrees, so cosine would be 0 of that. I mean, theoretically, you can even get values of -1 if they're complete opposites, but we don't see that. But that's what we're working on at the moment as well, to really see, can we provide that extra validation and say, based on that, can we actually show which products can be compared, where are comparisons valid or not. So we did some of that as an example for the products that we had in that table from the FAO earlier. Started looking and basically started coloring. I mean, products that are green can be compared. Products that are dark red, of course, cannot be compared. So if we look at it from that, I mean, whole milk can be compared to skim milk, no surprise there. Based on a nutrient basis can be compared to cheese. What we do see as well, for instance, here, I mean, if we're looking at shrimps, if we're looking at herring, so the fish, they can of course be compared reasonably well to each other. There's a whole load of products that it cannot be compared to. So by doing this, we're hoping to take a bit of the, well, let's call it people making stupid comparisons out of the equation as well. Big question in all these things. I mean, as we said earlier, the big advantage is we can go to a food composition table, we can take the nutrients out of it and we can calculate with that, which makes it nice, which makes it easy. Question, of course, always that has come up, is focusing on nutrients enough? Because we can start challenging a few things as well. If we look at an NRF score, nutrient-rich food score like this, what we actually see is it tends to become a mix of nutrient requirements for proteins, for the vitamins and those things. But fiber, for instance, is not really a nutrient requirement. It's a dietary risk factor. On the other hand, what they call nutrients to limit, I mean, for saturated fat, we know that it's a dietary risk factor, not a nutrient thing, and B, that it's incredibly matrix dependent, added sugars the same, salt the same. So the big question is, can we actually lump all of it into a score like that or not? And that's where we've been looking as well at, can we actually separate nutrition and health and basically say, can we consider a third dimension? So the environmental impact part, life cycle analysis, life cycle assessment, that can still be done. I mean, these nutrient-rich scores, I mean, that works nicely if we're looking at nutrient adequacy, so we can do it for that quite easily. But then the question, of course, also is, can we include something related to health in there? How can we put human health in there? And if we're doing that, of course, if we're looking at that, how to quantify human health effects, basically, that's, well, where you need to start using epidemiology and data from that quite a bit. And biggest thing available from that perspective, most data is in the global burden of disease studies there that have a lot of risk factors estimated, including dietary risk factors for different countries, for different dietary risks. So that's something that is there that is quite useful. And if you look at dietary risks and the global burden of disease, typically what we see in there, so what are the key risk factors? Diets low in whole grains, high in sodium, low in fruits, diets low in nuts and seeds, low in vegetables, low in omega-3 fatty acids, low in fiber, polyunsaturated fatty acids, low in legumes, high in trans fats, of course. I mean, no surprise there. Diets high in sugar-sweetened beverages. So that's where we already start seeing one of these distinctions with the nutrient-rich profiling these factors. All sugar gets counted as bad. If we look at dietary risk factors from global burden of disease, then it's really related to sugar-sweetened beverages. And that is, of course, where we know the big issue tends to be. Diets low in calcium and diets low in milk are seen as a dietary risk factor as well. So that's where actually things start looking good for milk as well. Diets high in red meat and in processed meat. So we're looking at various factors. Sometimes it can be components, whether they're high and low. Sometimes it can be food groups, whether they're high or low in diets. But you get a lot of these dietary risk factors that you can actually use. And then, of course, one of the challenges is, can you convert some of that to a product level as well? Unfortunately, people in the US a couple of years ago really started doing that. Some very nice work from Caterina Stiliano there, where they basically said, can we convert those dietary risk factors onto a potential impact of a product on health? And what they basically did is start looking at products and start looking at what's in them. On the one hand, I mean, they did their normal LCAs for environmental impacting. On the other hand, they calculated what they called health and nutrition index, where they basically looked for a product, and in this case, we're looking at chicken wings. What are the ingredients in a product like that, and how would they contribute to health? Are some of the things positive? Are some of the things negative? Because what you find in there, I mean, you find sodium in there, you find trans fatty acids in there that are a dietary risk factor, you find polyunsaturated fatty acids, you find calcium. I mean, those are the ones in that example really that count. What you do see there basically is the negative ones, so that's the sodium, the trans fats, count higher than the positive ones, so that is the calcium and the polyunsaturated fatty acids. So you would actually get a negative score in this case. So in their health and nutrition index, negative scores basically mean negative health impact. Positive scores could be positive health impact, and what they basically expressed it in is minutes of healthy life lost from that perspective. But that gives us a nice way of looking at products and really start quantifying what's there. Can we start looking at it and start seeing, hey, can we attribute certain effects, certain health and disease burden to products based on that? Does that work quite nicely? And you can basically then calculate your dietary risk factors for different things. So per gram of omegas, per gram of calcium, per gram of fruit or something like that. Is it a positive or a negative factor? What is the risk? And can I start integrating that into my life cycle analysis as well? And it works reasonably well. Some of the examples they calculated at the time, for instance, I mean, what do we see from different products? That hot dogs, well, if they looked at their health burden and minutes of healthy life per serving, then that is one that ended up at about minus 35, I think. So you'd actually say, okay, that's not a good one. Some of the others start looking more positive. Salted peanuts is one of the interesting ones. I mean, you'd have a bit of negative because of the salt, but nuts is a positive one. So overall, that balances out positively in their things. Pizzas are interesting ones. Vegetable pizzas, on the one hand, some negative scores because of salt in there, and other things, positive scores on the other hand because of vegetables and some fiber in there. So you see that starts averaging out a bit more in the middle. And like that, you can really start looking at, okay, what can I do with products? Are they likely to contribute positively or negatively to human health? I mean, they looked at it from that perspective, whole range of products. Well, I said earlier, we had the hot dogs there that came out quite negative from that perspective. That processed meat in general tends to come out quite negative. If we look from a dairy perspective, then it's a bit as what we saw earlier with that health, with the nutrient-rich profiling as well. We see it coming out in the middle, pretty steady. I mean, sometimes a bit higher, sometimes a bit lower, but it is never the outlier there. So from that perspective, that works quite nicely as well. Of course, I mean, when they published that, hit the social media, people started doing, taking it a bit too far and saying eating a hot dog can take 36 minutes off your life. Well, that's certainly not the intention of what we're doing here, but that's what people start looking at. In the same way, I mean, if you want to lose a year of your life in this, you need to eat nearly 15,000 hot dogs if you want to put it in that perspective. So whether it is that bad, you can also start wondering. But basically, what we started looking at this approach as well in some recent work that we did and say, okay, on the one hand, we can look at nutrient density. So what can we do from nutrient perspective? On the other hand, we can also get that health impact in there. And are these things that basically come together? Are these things that are different? So are they complementary or not? Is one of the things we've been looking at. So we can do that nutrient-rich food score that we saw earlier, purely looking at nutrients. What is there? How much is there compared to recommended daily intake? And what's there? We can also do that health impact from a health and nutritional indicator. Calculate them. We did it in this case for the Netherlands, so we calculated the dietary risk factors for the Netherlands, because what you see is these shift a bit from country to country based on what is the basic underlying diet. So we did in this case specifically for the Netherlands. So for our apple pie, we could calculate that nutrient-rich voting. We can also calculate that health and nutrition indicator from that perspective by looking what's in there. And that's where you see, for instance, well, an apple pie, it contains fiber, which is seen as positive there. A bit of negative points for sodium, of course. Calcium positive again. Fruit is seen as positive. So you really start looking at how am I scoring on each of these indicators and what would that mean for my dietary risk factors. And so we did that for about, I think, 2,500, 3,000 products, really to start looking at how does that link. I mean, is high in nutrients the same as positive for health, or is it very different? So what we did is put that health and nutrition indicator here on the x-axis, positive values good, negative values not good, and we put that nutrient-rich food score on the y-axis as well then. And started looking at how do they correlate. What we do see there is in green, the vegetables, in orange fruits. What we see there, I think legumes in that light green are hiding there as well. They tend to be in that area of both fairly positive scores, highly positive scores on health and nutrition indicator and on nutrient-rich food. So we're seeing there they bring nutrients and they contribute to health. On the other hand, what we see, particularly here in red and in purple underneath, are red meat and processed meat, is one of these where we say, yes, they bring nutrients and they can actually go quite high in some cases in that nutrient-rich food index, but there could be a negative health impact. And then, of course, our big question always is, what is dairy doing? I mean, that's the light blue. What we really see is, I mean, that's a nice vertical one in the middle. From a health impact, it tends to be close to zero, slightly positive when we look at this. And we see the same for fish, for instance, the darker blues. But it can bring a lot of nutrients, of course. I mean, it can go very high in these nutrient-rich food scores there. So what we do see there is, I mean, definitely not a one-to-one correlation. So we might need to consider the nutritional profile and the health separately in these cases. And that's what we also saw, for instance, where we started looking at this with environmental impact as well, global warming potential. That's where we see similar scores, similar profiles as well, that if we start considering that health and nutrition indicator on top here, then we do in some cases see products that would score negative. Again, the meat products tend to come there. On the other hand, fruit and vegetables might score. On the other side, dairy, again, pretty much in the middle there. So, and that's what we keep seeing in a lot of these things. So if we're saying, hey, we want to separate these things, separate nutrition and health in something like this, it can be done. I mean, the life cycle assessment is there. It is what it is. It can be done. Standard methodology is no problem at all. Can look at these nutrient profiling things, but what we really see there is nutrient profiling is very valuable, but keep it to nutrients. Do not start dropping in other things. Do not start dropping in dietary risk factors or anything like that. It confuses. You're looking at different units that you cannot add or anything like that, so it becomes very difficult. If you want to include human health, then really start looking at those health and nutrition indicators, start looking at dietary risk factors, because they can be calculated separately as well. And of course, if we're looking at that bigger picture, I mean, where are we now with all these things? What is happening? What is happening all over the world? Is it perfect? No. That's as simple as it is. I mean, can we wait for perfect? Probably not either. Because there is pressure, of course. I mean, we see governments all over the world that start looking at wanting to put environmental impact labeling on products as well. We see the discussions, we see the debates. I mean, this is not something that we say, let's spend another 10, 20 or 30 years on and see how we go. From a nutritional perspective, we might say as well, of course, well, maybe we want protein quality in there. Should we consider bioavailability of nutrients? Should we consider food matrix effects, anti-nutritional factors? And part of me would say there, yes, of course, I'd love to include all of that in there. Problem, on the other hand, very simply, is we don't have enough data. So it's something that we can do for a few products. It's something where we can show, yes, protein quality could have an effect. Bioavailability of nutrients could have an effect, all those things. But I cannot take a Dutch food composition table or an Australian one or anything like that and add protein quality, add bioavailability to all of that. So there is simply not enough data for that, and it is unlikely to become available quick enough really to integrate. So we've almost got to deal with what we have at the moment, because if we keep aiming for that perfect one that includes everything, it's fine to do in a university, you know, and to look at what could be possible. The reality is the speed at which this field is moving in policy making as well. If the data are not there today, then you're too late already. So it looks like a lot of this will have to do with data that are currently available, and a lot of that is environmental or food composition data. Yeah. So really, if we look at that in a bigger perspective, where do we stand? What do we see? I mean, environmental reporting, it's on the agenda everywhere. We can't avoid that. I mean, we know that just reporting on a mass basis is flawed and that nutrition is important. I mean, we know we need to integrate that. Of course, that is step one. I mean, step one is understanding that you have a problem and that you need to do something. But we're still stuck sometimes in we know what is wrong, but we don't know yet what is right. I mean, what we can see is there, we can do nutrition, we can do health, we can decide how many nutrients we want to include. At the end, I mean, it will have to be something that needs to be a compromise. I mean, it can't be a sector-specific thing. That from a dairy perspective, we might favor a very different type of nutrient profiling score than the meat sector might favor, and it might be very different again than fruit and veg, of course. So what we'll probably end up with is a broad spectrum score there. The other thing there that we really need to look at is keep that end user in mind. I mean, is this intended for consumers? Then how can we actually make sure that they understand what they're dealing with? Is this intended for policymakers? Then maybe we start looking at it from a very different approach. So that is a critical one in there as well. So with that, I'd like to finish up the presentation for today and hope to have shown you a bit. I mean, if we're looking at on the one hand, sustainability, environmental impact of foods, whether that's dairy, whether that's any other product, then we can do the LCA purely on a kilogram or a liter basis. That's no problem. But if we start interpreting it, if we start looking at comparison of products, then we really need to start looking at that nutrition and health space as well. How to do that? I mean, that tends to be an interesting challenge. Do you look purely from a nutrition perspective and only are we supplying enough nutrients compared to recommended daily intake? Then I would say to some extent fairly straightforward. It's something we can keep moving with. On the other hand, do you want to integrate health in there as well? Again, it's possible. It's a bit more effort. But it's really looking at what do we aim to achieve with this, who is going to use it, what can be done, and also very much looking at data availability for that, because I think there will be two parts to this. I mean, there will be the, let's call it the academic challenge of how complete can I make it, can I integrate everything, and that's one thing. On the other hand, if we're looking outside that, if we're looking at policy making, environmental reporting, all these things, then it's going to be much more what can we do with what is already available and does not need another 5 or 10 or even 20 years of data collection. So with that, thank you very much for your attention, and of course more than happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thanks so much, Tom. You'll see in the chat box there a couple of questions already. So if you can read those out in full, please, and go ahead and answer them.
Yeah, see them there. First one from Ian. You may answer it by the end of the presentation. Let's see if I've done that. But I'm interested in whether you have applied the nLCA approach to compare different diet types, i.e. Mediterranean, rather than compare product types. Yes, we have done similar things there as well, indeed. Because this is something where on the one hand we say, okay, we can do it in products. And that's where a lot of the attention in, for instance, labeling and those kind of things tends to go to, but at the end of the day, it has to fit together in diets as well. So we've also looked at that quite a bit. How do these things come together in diets? Looking at, do I provide a complete diet perspective? We looked at it a lot with diet optimization tools as well, with linear programming, where we basically had a couple of hundred products with nutrient profiles, with nutrient profiles and environmental impact behind it, and then start looking at how can I optimize those diets to drive down environmental impact while still keeping all the nutrients in there. So yeah, these things, I mean, they can be done on a product basis, they can be done on a diet basis, they can be done even to some extent on a food system basis. if we start looking at it in a bigger scale, big challenge in all these things is data availability. And that's where we do see in general nutrient content of products quite easy to get. Once we start looking, can we get the right LCA data, then it already becomes more challenging. That I think in the Netherlands we've been quite lucky in that way that the government actually had a whole set of food items done, decent LCAs done on that, all done by the same agency, and they put them out. So we have a data set of about 250 products that are publicly available that we can couple nutritional profiles to quite easily. So we can use for a lot of that. So we can do a lot of that. On the other hand, I mean, we do see that we're relatively lucky in that many other countries don't have these widespread data sets. So if I want to do an nLCA on a Mediterranean diet, then I need to make sure that I have the right data from that perspective as well. And that also means having local data. Because of course, if I stick a liter of milk in a diet in the Netherlands, then I want the Dutch milk. If I stick a liter of milk in a diet in, say, Greece or in Spain, I need their data because that impact is going to be quite different. But once you have the data, you can do these things on every level. And the next one from Melissa. Should we be considering the food matrix as well, or are we overthinking it? Well, I think what we saw there, and I did go a bit towards it at the end, is it's a nice to have, and it's a very difficult one to have as well. I think to some extent, if you start looking at health impact, you do see that food matrix is included at some level. Because you do see, for instance, there already that sugar is not there as a bad thing per se. It's sugar-sweetened beverages. Already kind of making that indication of, hey, for some food matrices we need to consider it, for others not. The other thing that people haven't picked up on as well as they maybe could or should have, if we look at the most recent global burden of disease, saturated fat is not in there as a dietary risk factor anymore. I mean, in the past it used to be. In the 2019 one that was put out, saturated fat is not a risk factor anymore. So from that perspective, that is looking quite good from a dairy perspective as well. There, if we look at, say, a lot of the food matrix effects that people have been looking at, I mean, dairy fat in relation to cholesterol, matrix effects in terms of bioavailability of nutrients, protein digestion, or those things, I would struggle to include them on something like this because I can't really convert them into a single parameter that could be included in an nLCA. So I think food matrix effects from that perspective will probably become more like a supplementary storyline where we say, okay, next to what we purely see based on nutrients, we need to consider the food rather than that we can get a very simple number that we can actually start putting in as a correction factor for those things. Because I think if we need to start getting those for all the foods that we want, then initially we probably need to think 5 years on how to calculate that correction factor. And then we might need to do another 50 years of research to actually collect all the data. So I think it's an important storyline. It's probably not a calculation that is done easily. Next one from Ian again, following on from the previous question, do you see nLCA approach starting to influence national dietary guidelines too? As in, do we see Well, we basically see it more in another way, I suppose, that if we looked at it in the past, of course, dietary guidelines were based on nutrients, and that was it. What we do see much more, of course, now is environmental impact considerations are starting to come into dietary guidelines as well. So that's one of the things that we have been seeing quite a bit. That has been quite big there. Luckily, it hasn't gone as far as, say, consider environment first and nutrition second. Are they actually considering nLCAs? In a sense, yes, because they're balancing nutrition and environmental impact there as well. And it depends a bit from country to country. I mean, what we see in some areas, people start classifying, let's say, the plant-based alternatives in dairy categories already in their dietary guidelines. In other countries, not. What we've seen in the Netherlands, but that has always been there or there for quite a long time, is the Food Council being quite clear that if for some reason you choose not to consume milk, then only a fortified soy beverage seems to be an appropriate alternative, none of the others. So from that perspective, we do see some of this as well. So we do see it bit by bit happening everywhere, but it depends a bit by country whether it will take center stage or not. Question from Jenny there. Has there been a comparison of quantity of water required to grow plant-based drink crops with dairy? Oh yes, there has been. And there's been quite a lot there indeed. It's one of the difficulties, what I said at the start as well. A lot of the discussion in the public field is about carbon footprint, it's about global warming potential. There are many other aspects really of environmental impact. Water use is one of them, and that's where you do see in some cases indeed that there's a lot more requirement for water for some of these crops, and particularly as well, we've seen the same, of course, when the Eat Lancet diet came out a couple of years ago, and they started saying, okay, we need to start eating, I don't know what it was, 25 or 50 grams of nuts in our diets to make it more sustainable. That's where you see as well. I mean, the water use in some of those things is, of course, incredible as well. So you kind of get a similar challenge here. On the one hand, we say we want to consider nutrition as broadly as possible, not focus on a single nutrient. You should do it from an environmental impact perspective as well. And some people have been looking there as well, of can they make overall scores that do not just consider CO2, but consider water use as well, consider acidification, freshwater eutrophication, and many other environmental impacts. So to get a complete picture there as well. Tricky part is if you have two aggregate scores, one for nutrition, one for environmental impact, you start comparing that. It's great that you get a single number. It becomes very difficult to interpret for people as well. And I think that's one of the difficult or tricky ones that we always need to keep in mind for these things, is to really say we can calculate a lot, but we have to make sure that it stays easy and understandable for the target audience as well, whether that's consumers, whether that's scientists, whether that's policy makers or something like that. So sometimes we have a tendency to overcomplicate it a bit by trying to throw everything into a single score.
Okay. Tom, thank you so much for another wonderful, wonderful webinar. We really appreciate all the work that you've put into this and to every webinar that you have presented thus far. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording